The Capitol dome was a stark silhouette against the deep blue of the pre-dawn sky, a pocket of silence before the city's morning rush. Inside the Russell Senate office building, Senator Ted Cruz was already at his desk. It was just past 5:00 a.m. While Washington slept, he was honing his arguments, reviewing legal precedents for a looming Judiciary Committee battle. The previous day, his podcast, The Verdict, had detonated across the political landscape. In it, he had systematically dismantled a new progressive initiative championed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, a multi-billion-dollar federal grant program for community organizations. Cruz had branded it a constitutionally abhorrent slush fund, a blatant scheme designed to funnel taxpayer dollars directly to Warren's ideological allies to bypass the legislative process. The episode had galvanized the conservative base and sent shockwaves through the Democratic establishment. His private line, the one reserved for colleagues and senior staff, rang. He glanced at the caller ID, a senior Democratic senator, a well-known deal-maker who often acted as an intermediary. Cruz answered, his voice level. The tone on the other end was friendly, almost conciliatory, but the message was pure steel. "Ted," the voice said, "I'm calling as a friend. Senator Warren is deeply invested in the Community Investment Act. Your rhetoric is being perceived as a personal attack, and frankly, it's making things difficult. It would be a shame if this disagreement were to impact our work on the upcoming judicial nominations. It would be one to lower the temperature." It wasn't a vague warning, it was a direct threat wrapped in the genteel language of the Senate. Cruz remained silent for a moment, letting it hang in the air. This was confirmation. He had struck a nerve. "Thank you for the call," he said, his voice cold and precise, before ending the connection. He leaned back in his chair, not in panic but with a grim sense of clarity. He opened a secure file on his computer and typed a detailed memo of the conversation, noting the time and the exact phrasing. He sent it to his personal counsel with a simple message. "For the record, they are making their move. We will not be backing down." A knock came at his door. It was Ethan, his chief of staff. "We've got Meet the Press offering the whole show on Sunday, and Fox wants you for a primetime special. They all want your reaction to the firestorm you started." Cruz stood, the strategist in him taking over. "I'll give them more than a reaction." What he didn't say was that he was going to expose the threat, but not yet, not before he had indisputable proof. If Senator Warren, the very symbol of the progressive establishment, was trying to intimidate him into silence, he would make sure the entire country saw the machinery she operated. By mid-morning, Cruz's office had transformed into a command center. Screens flickered with live cable feeds. Messages poured in from allies and enemies alike. His critics on MSNBC were calling his podcast a dangerous and baseless smear. Fox News, on the other hand, couldn't get enough of him. But it wasn't the media frenzy that had his team on edge. It was the calculated silence from Senator Warren's office. At 10:47 a.m., Ethan walked in again, quietly closing the door behind him. "I think you should see this," he said, sliding a slim folder across the mahogany desk. There were no grainy photos inside. It was a document, an internal strategy memo from a major progressive think tank, an organization known to be an unofficial arm of Senator Warren's policy machine. "Who sent this?" Cruz asked, his voice tight. Ethan hesitated. "A source, a disillusioned staffer who believes the party is going too far. Said they owed it to the institution. The source said to tell you she is not acting alone." Cruz's eyes narrowed as he read. The memo detailed a media and activist strategy to ensure the passage of the funding bill. But on page 4, a chilling paragraph detailed a counter-messaging plan against key opponents. Under the heading Neutralization was a single name, Senator Ted Cruz. It mentioned leveraging donor network pressure and allied media assets to discredit him. It was a blueprint for a political takedown. So it was true. Warren wasn't just watching. She was operating a network from behind the curtain, coordinating with outside groups that her own legislation would soon fund. The timing made sense. This wasn't about legacy, it was about power, and he had dared to challenge it. "I want this authenticated by 2 more sources," Cruz said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then I go public." "Are you sure, Senator?" Ethan asked. Once you say her name on the record and produce this, it'll be war. It'll be war, Ethan warned. The media, the donors, her entire network, they'll come after you with everything they have. A cold smile formed on Ted Cruz's face. Good, let them. He turned to the window, the view of the Capitol grounds stretching before him. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but with absolute clarity. This was no longer about a single piece of legislation. It was about raw power, enforced silence, and the fundamental right to challenge the ruling orthodoxy without facing intimidation. He wasn't going to detonate this on Fox News. That would be too easy, too predictable, and too easily dismissed by his opponents. No, Cruz had a bigger idea, one that would pull the curtain down all at once. It wasn't enough to fight back. He had to expose the entire operation. For that, he needed a stage big enough, live enough, and loud enough to rattle the very spine of Washington's establishment. He picked up his phone. "Ethan," he said, "get me on 60 Minutes." The CBS studio wasn't foreign ground. Cruz had sparred on Face the Nation and debated policy on CBS This Morning more than once. But this time, his appearance on 60 Minutes came with an eerie stillness. His team had submitted the official talking points: fiscal responsibility, border security, and his recent clash with progressive-led spending initiatives. But behind the scenes, the buzz wasn't about policy. It was about a name no one dared speak on the record. The producer, an older man with silver temples and a stiff blue blazer, pulled him aside moments before taping. "Senator, there is something I need to say off the record," he muttered. Cruz kept his face unreadable. "Go ahead." He leaned in. "This segment, it's not just about you. There's interest, higher interest. I was asked to gently advise you that keeping this focused on the policy, rather than making it personal against Senator Warren, would be more productive." Cruz's expression didn't change, but his spine straightened. "Are you threatening me on behalf of your network or on behalf of the senator?" "Of course not." The producer's voice was hushed, panicked. "I'm trying to help you. Look, if you stay in your lane, you'll be fine. You'll keep your influence, your future, but if you go rogue..." Cruz cut him off, his voice low and sharp. "Rogue is what the establishment calls a senator who actually upholds his oath instead of bending to pressure." The producer sighed, stepping back. "I warned you." With that, Cruz walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing with rhythmic defiance against the polished floor. The host smiled, the camera lights warming the room, but Cruz wasn't listening to the small talk. He was focused on one thing: what he would say and when. Halfway through the segment, the host brought up the podcast and the funding scandal. Cruz nodded calmly, then leaned slightly forward. "There's more to this story," he said. The host blinked. "More?" "Yes. This isn't just about a bad bill. It is about a coordinated effort to silence dissent, originating from the highest levels of the United States Senate. I was warned to back down. A threat was delivered by a fellow senator on behalf of a colleague who is spearheading this legislation." He paused, the camera fixed on him, his gaze unflinching. "That colleague's name is Senator Elizabeth Warren." The room fell utterly silent. A producer dropped a clipboard behind the camera. The host's professional veneer cracked, his expression flattened. "You are accusing a sitting United States senator of threatening you?" "I am not accusing," Cruz stated, his tone precise and firm. "I am confirming, and I am not afraid." That moment would go down in broadcast history, not just because he said her name, but because he said it without a trace of hesitation, and the nation heard it live. By the time Cruz stepped off the 60 Minutes stage, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Not texts, not emails, calls. The first was from Ethan, his chief of staff. "The Senate Majority Leader's office is in meltdown," he said, his voice tense. "Warren's office just released a statement calling your remarks a defamatory, desperate, and pathetic lie from a known political arsonist." The second was from his father, watching from Texas. "You didn't blink, son," he said quietly. "You looked the whole country right in the eye." The third was from an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. A transcript hit his inbox seconds later. It was one sentence. "You went too far. You've made enemies you can't see. Take it back or take the consequences." Cruz exhaled, calm but coiled. The mainstream media descended like a swarm. CNN ran a segment titled Cruz's Dangerous Game, undermining the Senate. The New York Times posted an op-ed titled The Reckless Audacity of Ted Cruz. On an X, the platform was split down the middle. WarrenGate and hashtag Cruz Conspiracy trended simultaneously. Fox News, meanwhile, replayed the 60 Minutes clip on a loop, a chyron blazing. Cruz accuses Warren of threats, names names. But the part they missed was that he had the receipts. Back in his Senate office that night, he laid them all out across the conference table. The leaked strategy memo with his name in it, timelines of meetings between Warren's staff and federal regulators, and his own notarized affidavit detailing the threatening phone call. His chief of staff, Ethan, sat across from him. "If you drop these," Ethan said, his voice grave, "you're not just exposing a private pressure campaign. You're ripping open the firewall between political influence and unconstitutional intimidation by a sitting senator." Cruz didn't blink. "Good." Ethan hesitated. "They will try to destroy you, personally and politically." Cruz leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the memo. "Then let them try. This isn't about my career, Ethan. This is about Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress is granted the power to legislate, not unaccountable backroom networks run by my colleagues. If we allow that to die, the republic is finished." He had a folder prepared for 3 news organizations, plus one for the Senate Ethics Committee and the Department of Justice. He wasn't naive. Some would ignore it, some would twist it, but one would run with it. That was all he needed. Outside his window, protesters were already forming on the sidewalk below, small, loud, and divided. Some waved signs that read, "Truth Matters, Senator Cruz." Others shouted, "Censure Cruz." He didn't flinch. Tomorrow, he'd drop the first document. Let Washington try to spin its way out of facts. This wasn't a war of narratives anymore. It was a war of evidence, and Ted Cruz had just declared it. The next morning, Cruz didn't release a press statement. He posted a single photo to his 6 million followers on X. One image, one caption. The image was a high-resolution scan of the strategy memo, with names and certain details heavily redacted. But the letterhead of the progressive think tank was clear, as was the section title, Neutralization, and his own name listed beneath it. The caption read, "You wanted silence, I chose sunlight." The post detonated. Within minutes, X was trending with hashtag Warren Memo, hashtag Cruz Receipts, and hashtag Shadow Network. Conservative influencers called it the smoking gun. Liberal outlets scrambled to label it a fabrication. Senator Warren's office released a furious denial. This is a forged document, a pathetic stunt from a man who will lie about anything to distract from his own extremism. But Cruz didn't stop there. He had his office send the full, unredacted copies to 3 outlets: Fox News, The Daily Wire, and crucially, Politico. While Fox's reaction was predictable, it was Politico that shocked the Beltway. Their headline read, "Leaked memo suggests coordinated neutralization plan against Cruz, raising questions about Warren's network." Inside, Politico cautiously dissected the document. The language matched prior communications from the think tank. The metadata, they noted, appeared authentic. The names, though not published, were known figures in the progressive policy sphere with deep ties to Senator Warren's office. The press couldn't look away. MSNBC tried to bury it, but by noon, even CNN was forced to discuss it. Their panel was split. "It's reckless," one panelist said, "but if it's real, this is a crisis for the Senate." That afternoon, Cruz held his press conference. He walked onto the Senate floor, invoking a point of personal privilege. He stood before the C-SPAN cameras, the American flag pin on his lapel. He didn't take questions. He held up a copy of the memo. "Mr. President," he began, addressing the chamber, "there is no principle more sacred to this republic than the separation of powers and the integrity of the legislative process granted to this body by the Constitution of the United States. Efforts to subvert that process, to intimidate members, and to operate shadow campaigns to achieve policy ends are an existential threat to this institution." He paused, his voice ringing with conviction. "I am now entering into the congressional record, a document which I believe provides evidence of such a campaign." He laid the folder on the clerk's desk and walked off the floor. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a constitutional crisis. It was a constitutional crisis, and Ted Cruz had lit the match. By nightfall, Washington was in full lockdown mode, not physically, but strategically. Every network was chasing his name, every newsroom divided on tone. Some anchors begged for context, others barked out warnings of Senate instability. Cruz's name was now echoing not only through social feeds, but through secured government servers. At 9:47 p.m., an encrypted message appeared on his phone. Not from a reporter, not from a troll, from a sitting senator. "Shut it down, Ted, for your own good." No signature, but the source was clear. A fellow Republican on the Judiciary Committee trying to de-escalate a war he feared they couldn't win. At 10:03 p.m., the establishment pushed back. The live feed for his planned press conference, where he intended to release the unredacted memo, was jammed. 2 minutes before going live, the signal from his office, routed through a secure server, was inexplicably corrupted. His digital team scrambled. VPNs collapsed. Cloud storage was flagged for suspicious outbound flow. Cruz didn't panic, he pivoted. From his office, he recorded a direct-to-camera video on his phone and posted it to his followers. "They just tried to shut down our broadcast," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Ask yourselves, who has the power to kill a secure Senate feed in 2025? Not critics, not trolls, real, unaccountable power. I will be on the Senate floor tomorrow afternoon to release the full, unredacted document. Let them try to shut down the C-SPAN cameras." The video hit 14 million views overnight. The next day, he made his move. He walked to the Senate floor holding the second memo. "I rise today," he began, "to speak about a cancer on this institution. Yesterday, I was prevented from speaking to the American people by forces unknown, but they cannot silence me here." He held up the document. "This is the unredacted memo I was blocked from releasing. It details a coordinated campaign to use activist groups, funded by taxpayer money, to intimidate a sitting United States senator. A campaign directed by aides and consultants in the orbit of Senator Elizabeth Warren." He didn't flinch as he read the names of the individuals involved, their organizations, and the dates of their meetings. The chamber was still. The country stopped. Within 24 hours, the Senate Ethics Committee called an emergency hearing. Officially, it was framed as an inquiry into the conduct of Senator Cruz and the release of unverified information. Unofficially, everyone knew what it was: a public flogging, an attempt by the Democratic leadership to embarrass, intimidate, and silence him before he became a force too large to contain. The chamber was packed. Every major network tuned in. The committee chairman, a staunch Warren ally, sat stone-faced at the head desk. Chuck Schumer watched from the side, whispering to Senator Booker. In the minority, Mitch McConnell observed silently, his expression unreadable. Ted Cruz walked in wearing a simple navy suit, the American flag pinned to one lapel. No entourage, no team of lawyers flanking him. Just him. The chair banged the gavel. "Senator Cruz, you have been summoned here today to address the serious concerns regarding your public accusations." But Cruz interrupted, his voice calm, firm, and carrying the weight of a courtroom litigator. "Accusations backed by evidence, Mr. Chairman. And if this chamber still respects the Constitution, I would like to present that evidence, under oath." Murmurs rippled across the room. Senator Booker raised an eyebrow. Cruz looked directly at the chairman, his gaze unwavering. "You mean to tell us you're willing to be cross-examined?" He nodded once, in full view of the American people. That wasn't the plan. The committee expected panic, not poise. They expected retreat, not defiance. Cruz placed a folder on the table. He opened it and pulled out the second memo, the unredacted one. This document shows direct coordination between Senator Warren's senior policy advisors and lobbyists from the very nonprofit organizations her legislation is designed to fund. Page 3, Cruz spoke clearly, his voice resonating in the hushed room. Details meeting notes from March 9th. That is 18 days before the EPA, without consulting the relevant congressional committees, issued a regulatory shift. A shift this chamber never formally approved, but which was outlined as a primary policy goal in this very memo. The Democratic chairman slammed his hand on the table. "Senator Cruz, these documents are unverified." "They are verified," Cruz shot back, his voice like flint, by 3 independent cybersecurity firms. And the metadata traces back to a server used by one of Senator Warren's most trusted outside consultants, a man who was her chief of staff until last year. Silence fell. The public feed, delayed by 3 seconds, gave network staffers just enough time to consider pulling the plug. But Cruz looked straight into the main camera. "If I am lying, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "then I invite this committee to recommend my censure for conduct unbecoming of a senator. If I am wrong, disprove me. But if I am right, and I have the evidence to prove it, then ask yourselves why this committee is investigating me, and not the powerful, coordinated network seeking to subvert the laws of the United States." The room froze. The cameras kept rolling. And for the first time, it was the Senate committee that looked like it had something to hide. By the next morning, #subpoena Warren was the #1 trending tag in America. Even Democrats were rattled. The footage of Cruz standing alone and staring down senior lawmakers with the unflinching resolve of a prosecutor played on a loop. On Fox, it was a declaration of truth. On CNN, it was discussed with caution. On MSNBC, it was met with a level of unease no one could disguise. But what came next, no one saw coming. A sitting Democrat, Senator David Miller from Montana, a gruff, old-school moderate who had worked with Warren on multiple committees, stepped up to the podium at a local town hall. He said 3 words that sent a political earthquake through Washington. "Cruz was right." Gasps rippled through the small auditorium. Reporters whipped out their phones. Miller, visibly conflicted, continued, "I have seen a copy of the documents. My staff has verified their authenticity, and I can no longer sit back while a wing of my own party, even with people I admire, attempts to pull strings from behind the curtain. The United States Senate must be beyond reproach." The clip spread like wildfire. By noon, 2 more moderate Democrats had signaled their support for an independent investigation. By 3 p.m., Politico published a piece titled, "Whispers Turned to Roars. Is Senator Warren's network real?" Meanwhile, Cruz stayed quiet. He wasn't silent. He was deliberate. His next move wasn't a press conference or a podcast. It was an old-school letter, printed, signed, and sent directly to the Senate Majority Leader and the Attorney General. In it, he formally called for a bipartisan resolution to launch a special counsel inquiry into the coordination between private foundations, former staffers, and current executive branch actions. It included the full digital audit logs from the leaked documents. It ended with a quote from the Federalist Papers, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." At the DNC, panic set in. In a conference call leaked hours later, a senior aide could be heard shouting, "How the hell did we let Cruz get this far? He was supposed to be a right-wing sideshow." But Ted Cruz wasn't acting like a sideshow anymore. He was acting like a constitutionalist on a mission, who no longer feared the establishment's wrath. Outside the Capitol, small crowds began to gather, holding handmade signs with 3 bold words, "We believe him." For 5 days, Senator Elizabeth Warren remained silent. The media speculated, cable panels buzzed, and columnists spilled ink trying to define the moment. Was it a partisan stunt or the start of a genuine constitutional reckoning? Cruz didn't speak during those 5 days either. He let the silence build, let the questions hang in the air, until on the 6th day, Senator Warren broke it. A surprise primetime interview dropped on a Friday evening with MSNBC's Rachel Maddow. Warren was not calm or measured. She was a fighter, radiating indignation. She dismissed the entire affair as a partisan smear. "This is a baseless attack from a man who has built his career on tearing down our institutions," she declared, "all to stop a program that helps working families. My office meets with hundreds of policy advocates. To twist standard policy discussions into some grand conspiracy is a lie. And frankly, it's pathetic." Maddow pressed, "So to be clear, Senator, are you denying the memos are real?" Warren didn't blink. "What I am saying is that this is a desperate political hit job. Not every meeting is a conspiracy. It wasn't a denial, and America knew it. By morning, conservative networks were ablaze. Fox News ran a chyron that read, 'Warren attacks Cruz but doesn't deny memos.' Even independents were turning. Cruz released a 5-minute segment on his podcast later that evening. No flashy production. She didn't deny it, he said simply. She just called it politics. But when a sitting senator's office conspires with outside groups to write federal regulations and bypass Congress, that's not politics. That's a corruption of the constitutional order. He laid out one new document, a meeting summary between Warren's top policy advisors and the director of the EPA, held just 3 weeks before a major regulatory change was announced. This time there was audio. A male voice confirmed by an independent analyst as one of Warren's senior consultants could be heard saying, "We'll let the EPA announce it, but we wrote it." Warren's defenders panicked. Progressive outlets called it a deceptively edited hit job. The New York Times ran a headline, "When leaked audio becomes a political weapon." But the public wasn't buying the spin. A new narrative emerged, Cruz versus the machine. And it was working. 1 week after Warren's MSNBC interview, Ted Cruz walked into the Hart Senate office building. He wasn't there to debate, he was there to testify. The Senate Ethics Committee had buckled under public and bipartisan pressure, led surprisingly by Senator Miller. They opened a formal hearing. The room was overflowing. Reporters packed every corner, their phones up. TikTok Live streamed from the balcony. Cruz stepped up to the microphone, calm and composed. "Mr. Chairman," he began, "I never thought my duty would bring me here. I was elected to legislate, not to expose the shadows operating within our own institution. But the attempts to intimidate me and subvert the legislative process left me no choice." Gasps rippled through the room. He pulled out a folder, opened it slowly, and revealed a printed email exchange, now confirmed by forensics. It was between Warren's chief of staff and a top official at the EPA. The subject line, "Finalizing language." The body, "Let's make sure this policy lands exactly as discussed with Elizabeth's team." A hush fell. A Democratic senator on the committee tried to interrupt. "Mr. Chairman, this is a partisan distraction from the real issues." Cruz raised his voice for the first time that day, cutting through the noise. "You call this a distraction? The American people call it a conspiracy to defraud them of their voice in government." He turned directly to the cameras. "If we allow any senator, no matter how powerful, to override the democratic process, then we have surrendered our republic." The room froze. Then something no one expected happened. Senator David Miller, the moderate Democrat from Montana, stood up. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice heavy, "I was skeptical of Senator Cruz, but the evidence he has presented today is deeply disturbing. I stand corrected, and I stand with his call for a full and independent investigation." Applause broke out. Not the usual polite claps, but thunder. Even some Democrats sat in stunned silence. The hearing was suspended due to the crowd's reaction, but the moment had already gone viral. The phrase, "You left me no choice," trended for 2 days. By that evening, a special counsel inquiry was all but guaranteed. Polls shifted as independents surged in support of Cruz's call for accountability. Warren's office issued a second statement, carefully worded and muted. It wasn't enough. Cruz walked out of the hearing room not just as a senator, but as a vindicated constitutionalist. He turned to the cameras one last time and said, "This fight isn't about left or right, it's about the rule of law versus the rule of power, and the law must always win." America was listening. In a political landscape often clouded by partisanship, Ted Cruz didn't just speak, he prosecuted his case in the court of public opinion and within the halls of the institution he served. He stepped onto the stage as a polarizing ideologue, but walked off as something far more powerful, a symbol of institutional defiance. His confrontation with Elizabeth Warren didn't hinge on insults. It was about evidence, the constitutional process, and the American people's right to know who truly pulls the strings. What began as a veiled threat in a phone call ended as a national reckoning. Cruz didn't flinch when confronted by power. He stood taller, and in doing so, he reminded an entire nation that courage isn't about being liked. It's about choosing to stand for the law, not once, but every time you refuse to back down.